Welcome everyone. It's great to see a full house here at CITP, and I'm delighted to welcome and introduce Professor Katrina Ligett. Professor Katrina is currently a professor at the Hebrew University, where she's also the head of the program on interfaces of technology, society, and networks, which seems to be a very CITP-like program. So we're delighted to have you here at CITP for a semester as our Microsoft visiting faculty. Katrina was previously a faculty at Caltech, and together at Caltech and Hebrew, she's the recipient of every Young Faculty Award that you can think about, including the NSF Career Award, as well as the Microsoft Faculty Fellowship. She's involved in leadership positions across a number of computer science conferences, including serving as an advisor for Harvard's OpenDP project, and I think that's very synergistic with her talk today on data privacy. Is important, but it's not enough. So let's welcome Professor Katrina.
Great, thanks so much. Thank you all for being here. Thanks to those of you who I experienced through the owl. Good to see you all. And for those of you who I haven't met yet, I'm here until late February. I would love to meet you. If we have common interests, send me an email. Let's schedule a time to have a chat. I'm really excited to be here. CITP is just this amazing place that I view as an opportunity for me to do a lot of learning. So please, I invite you to make connections if we haven't already. So today I'll be talking about thoughts and work that owe gratitude to many people. In particular, I want to pull out Kobbi Nissim, who is my co-organizer of the Umbrella Initiative, under which most of the work that I'll talk about today falls. He's a computer scientist at Georgetown. And also specifically today, I'll be talking about some joint work with Ayelet who recently started a postdoc at Georgetown, and Alex Wood, who's at Harvard. So I'm a computer scientist by training. Most of my work is theorems and proofs. Today will not be theorems and proofs. And so for me, this is the sort of early stages of what I hope will be an ongoing journey to try to figure out how somebody with technical background can have more interaction with and potentially sort of influence in the real world and policy spaces. With that, I, even more than usual, invite your questions, your comments, your critiques, your input, your pointers, your perspective, now and afterwards and forever. So please take this invitation. So with that, I'd like to dive in. The title of my talk speaks in some sense to how I came to think about this space. I grew up in some sense as a data privacy researcher working on differential privacy, and you'll see that influence, I think, in the perspective that I present here. But over time, as I've started to form my understanding of what I see as problems with the data ecosystem, I've come to realize that privacy is not the only problem, and the privacy sort of toolkit is not going to be sufficient. And I've tried to present here some thoughts on where I think we need to go with that in mind. Okay, so the starting point for today's discussion is a point where I think we have a lot of understanding and agreement in this room, which is that there's this amazing, rich and complex data ecosystem that has sprung up around our collective data over the past couple of decades. And that data has been crucial in sort of fueling a large number of really exciting innovations in all aspects of our lives and of our society. It has enabled experiences and services that we couldn't have dreamed about just a couple of decades ago. And along the way, somehow, data has become a multi-billion-dollar business, as we all know. And this particular graphic comes from a 2017 Economist article where they declared data is the new oil, that data had surpassed oil as the world's most valuable resource at that moment in time. And I like the imagery for many reasons here. So another thing that we've all seen, or many of us have seen, in various forms. It's surely out of date, this particular one that I've read. We all know that this data ecosystem that's sprung up is incredibly rich and complex, and that has good aspects and maybe potentially less good aspects. But the ways in which our personal data, our collective data is gathered, stored, processed, deployed, used are so complex and involve so many interactions among so many different entities, and form the basis of such a rich array of decisions and actions and influences on our individual worlds and our collective world, that I'll say that it's overwhelming even to the experts, and difficult to make sense of even to the greatest of experts. And I'm not saying me, anyone. So for today's talk, I'm going to take that big mess and I'm going to pare it down to a caricature, cartoon. And this is going to be a caricature of a piece of how that data ecosystem works, but I think it's an important piece, and I think it's a caricature that reflects some really important mechanisms, but it's not everything. So let me tell you first what I'm trying to draw for you in my little cartoon here. And then we'll take a little tour of some of the concerns that I think this caricature highlights for us. And we'll use this talk to explore those concerns in more depth and think about the tools that have been used or are available or discussed so far to address some of those concerns, and some of the limitations and where I think we might need to go in order to better address them. Okay. So this piece of the data ecosystem that I'm focusing on here is a system where data is being gathered from lots of individuals on the left-hand side, in order to surface correlations, trends, patterns, potentially even try to get a causation. And these sort of global observations are then on the right-hand side deployed in the service of providing recommendations to maybe the same individuals, maybe new people who show up to the system. Okay? So on the left-hand side there, we have a system that is designed to basically suck up as much information as it can about all of us. And that's extremely detailed information down to the split second of where we are and where our attention's going and where we're going online and where we're physically going and who we're interacting with. All of these things are being sort of sucked in on the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, what's going on is that data is continuously being used to refine personalization, prediction, recommendation algorithms that get used to personalize content recommendations for people. And that personalized content takes a wide variety of forms. It could be a personalized news item or product recommendation or an advertisement, a suggestion of who you should go on a date with, the color of the grass in the metaverse. Whatever it is, we get these sort of personalized worlds that we're exposed to that are a result of this system. And so in order to better understand this ecosystem, I think it's helpful, even though we all know about it, and I didn't say anything surprising here, right? Even though we all know about it, it's helpful to stop for a moment and ask ourselves, why? Why did we end up with this ecosystem? What's going on here? And again, it's not surprising, but it's worth stopping for a moment and thinking about it. Why do companies care about giving you good recommendations? Is it because they want you to have the best possible experience? Well, it's a little bit more complicated, of course. Why or sort of pushing back a level, more fundamentally, why are they sucking up all that information about all of us? Why? Well, there are a number of answers. One is that they want all the information because they want to improve their services. And that gives them a competitive edge, which gives them potentially more users or more time with those users, which often translates into making more money off of all of us. And often the mechanism for making that more money off of all of us is by showing us more ads. Okay. But there are other reasons also. They're also trying to get us to spend more and more time with their services because they have more time to show us those ads. And they're also trying to show us better and better ads. What do I mean by better ads? Ads that are more likely to make money off of us. So you can sort of see a theme here. And of course, these are not the only reasons, these are not the only ways that companies are making money in this space. We also have, maybe the data is being gathered in part for its future uses, even if we don't know how to use it today. Maybe we're stockpiling it so that we might be able to use it in somewhere down the line. But the bottom line is that at some level, this infrastructure has evolved into this finely tuned machine for capturing as much of our time and attention and money as possible. And it's useful to sort of keep that in mind. This sort of, okay, this is the thing that we're dealing with. We've got this amazing world that we live in where we can get incredibly accurate and useful personalization and recommendation, but it's not there just because it's nice to have personalized stuff. It's there because it's part of an architecture that's a powerful moneymaker. By the way, for the purposes of full disclosure, I should say, not only am I the Microsoft visiting professor here, I also consult for Google, just to put it on the table. Okay. And I think worth at this moment in time, just pointing to a couple of the ways in which data has become a very different thing over the past couple of years. Sort of along the way, as we've been building this system, data has simultaneously been evolving into something new. It's no longer sort of a stack of papers or books on a shelf somewhere. I mean, it's also still that, but it's also something with that through our IoT devices and our wearables and our continuous monitoring through our phones and our pockets and so on and so forth, has become this continuous fine-grained surveillance. So we have data that's at a level of detail and continuity that is unprecedented. And there's another aspect of data that I want to pull out here because it's going to recur as a theme as we go along. And that's, well, I think honestly, the idea that my data is mine and your data is yours, and we can talk about your data and my data, was always kind of on shaky ground. But in today's world, that's even more apparent that most data has at least some collective nature to it. And that's going to be an issue that we're going to have to return to and address. So why do I claim this? So I claim that there's sort of collective nature of data at a number of different levels. The most obvious is a lot of data is literally both about me and about someone else. It's an email that I sent to you. It's a picture of a time that we spent together. Those are sort of the obvious types of examples. Then there's maybe slightly more subtle information about me also tells you something about those who are close to me, either sort of through familiar relationship or through other relationships that we have. And so that sort of social connectedness that we have and genetic connectedness that we have and other connections that we have mean that it becomes unreasonable to talk about my data as solely mine and solely pertaining to me. And then there's the additional layer of subtlety that's really brought to the fore by this cartoon that I drew for you before, which is that my data and your data and our data is continuously being used in the service of drawing inferences about other people who we've never even met. We're never even going to meet them. But our collective data is continuously having an impact on the lives of people everywhere. And so again, this my data, your data thing could potentially get us into trouble. Sometimes it's a useful simplification or metaphor, but we should be aware that it's a serious simplification. So back to the cartoon. In the past decades even, a fair amount of attention has been paid to things that can go wrong in this cartoon that pertain to these arrows and this arrow. What do I mean by that? We started recently to get at least a bit of an inkling that we've got a privacy problem on our hands here. And so we've started to be concerned about all of this data gathering and this surveillance and these sort of arrows of data coming from individuals into this architecture. And what I'm going to point out as we go along is that there's another arrow here. And that arrow has gotten maybe less attention. And we're going to try to come back to this arrow. In order to do so, I'm going to redraw this cartoon to represent that really there's a cycle going on here. And I'm going to redraw it in this even more abstracted way. So now I have individuals and platforms, and I have data coming into platforms and personalized content returning to individuals. So I've abstracted things down just to this little cycle. Again, we lose a lot with an abstraction, but I feel like this is a useful thing to keep in mind. And this coarsening of my view of the world, I'm going to call stuff going from individuals to platforms, I'm going to call that the outgoing vector, taking the perspective of the individual. This is stuff coming out for me. And I'm going to call the other direction the provision of personalized recommendations, content, you name it. I'm going to call that the incoming vector. So first I want to focus on that outgoing vector. As I said, we collectively as a society have started to pay a lot of attention to this. And so we all know at some level that again, I'll put some quotes around that, my data in the wrong hands could lead to harms. It could be embarrassing. I could end up with higher insurance premiums. Maybe in some countries, in some sort of context, I could lose rights. The ability to buy a train ticket or send my kids to the schools that I want to. I could get a job application rejected, be blackmailed or coerced. In some places and contexts, I could risk arrest or bodily harm. There are a lot of concerns about that sort of pertain to where my data is going, who has it, what the consequences downstream could be. And those are concerns described here as manifesting at the individual level. But of course, we all also know that when you have these types of concerns manifesting at the individual level, there's societal level concerns as well. And I'll characterize those as surveillance types of concerns. But sort of basically, living in a world where this is happening to individuals can have chilling effects on things like free speech, can create basically an icky societal level environment. And I also just want to pull out here that we see the potential for amplified harms of these sorts to individuals and groups that are in many ways marginalized, whether it's you're from an ethnic minority or you're already disadvantaged in some way financially, you're sick, you often are more vulnerable to these types of concerns. As I said before, we know all of this. And there's been a lot of thinking into what can we do to address these outgoing vector concerns. So I want to do a brief, try to keep it brief, tour through some of the interventions that have evolved, because I want to point out that actually there's been a huge amount of innovation, both on the technical side and on the legal side in the past 10 to 15 years on addressing outgoing vector concerns. This is not to say that the problem is solved, but it's to say that there's a lot going on here, and we have actually a pretty rich toolkit. So I want to hint to that. Okay, so brief tour through the outgoing vector interventions. There's been a bunch of work that takes the flavor of distributing data and distributing computations. I'm not going to get technical in any of this, but feel free to ask questions. One example of this is really nice work on secure multi-party computation, which is starting to enter the realm of actual sort of practicality and feasibility. If you're not familiar with SMPC, what I'm going to ask you to think of it is, it's a way to take a situation where you normally would have needed to trust some entity in order to carry something out for you, and to change the trust model so that instead of having to trust a single entity, you have a far reduced sort of requirement in what you're assuming anybody is going to do in terms of their behavior. So it's something that doesn't get rid of trust, but sort of lowers a threshold for you. And so you can take many things that you would have done with centralized trust and you can convert them over using sort of mathematical tools for conversion to doing something where instead of needing to trust you with my data and with the computation, I rather only need to trust that enough people participating in a computation are going to do the right thing. But some of them can be misbehaved. And so there's a lot of nice work that has this kind of a flavor. There's differential privacy, which I view as sort of getting at outgoing vector concerns in a slightly different way. How you should think of differential privacy. Differential privacy is a way of taking some aggregate computation that you want to do on a bunch of people's data and enforcing that the results of that computation are not going to be very revealing of any one person's information. So those final results are not going to be very, very good at telling you about your data or your data or your data or your data, which is a good thing for privacy, but rather they're going to still maintain the aggregate properties. And you can do this in various ways, including sort of perturbing the data as it goes into the system, perturbing the results of the computation as it goes out, or potentially also sort of messing with the, the internals of the computation. So there are various ways to get the goal of differential privacy in place, but it's a way of saying you can still do your aggregate computation, but we're going to maintain the privacy of the individuals whose data contributed to the computation. We also have a whole sort of bunch of developments in the space of what I would call performing computations locally, moving away from models where I have to trust that somebody else is going to do the right thing, and rather being able to either sort of prove that a certain computation is going to be carried out the way that it's supposed to be carried out, or the idea that I can have somebody else do a computation for me without them actually being able to see the data on which the computation is being run, these kinds of things. So we have a bunch of things that help with these concerns about data going to the wrong places, control over where the data goes, who can use it. And it's really rich, it's really exciting. We also have a bunch of innovation going on in the legal space. And these, I'm going to talk at a very high level right now, but we're going to go into things in a little bit more detail as we go along. But in the outgoing vector world, we see both in the US, in some places, and in Europe, as well as some other places around the world, new restrictions on what data can be collected, under what conditions. We see restrictions on how and when data can be shared. We see these annoying cookie banners showing up all over the place, which is intended to have the effect of giving you some more control and choice in this space. And we see interventions that formalize the obligations of the parties that have access to our personal data, formalizing the idea sometimes that those obligations pass along with the data when you pass the data. I will say that much of this has the flavor of sort of a control toolkit, sort of trying to restrict flows of data. And I'm going to return to some critique of sort of a control mindset in general as we go along. But I'll say there's a lot that's exciting that's going on in this space. Okay, so this is the outgoing vector. Again, to remind ourselves, what am I talking about this outgoing vector thing? That's the data coming from individuals to platforms. Now I want to pay some attention to the incoming vector. First, I want to say privacy matters. All of this work in the space of the outgoing vector is incredibly important. We have not solved all the problems. I'm not saying privacy is solved. I'm just saying we have other problems too. So in particular, I want to claim that all those cool things that we've done and other people have done that relates to addressing outgoing vector concerns, they don't address the incoming vector. So, okay, so what do I mean by the incoming vector? Well, I want to point back to, in this cartoon to this arrow. This is the provision of personalized content recommendations, so on and so forth. What does it mean to protect the incoming vector or to focus in on these concerns? So, as we said, Platforms, by way of personalization, shape our options and our choices. They affect how we spend our money, who we date and marry, what we see, what we read, our impression of public opinion and of reality. And this raises really deep questions of, am I individually being manipulated, and by whom, for what ends? Am I being discriminated against in the opportunities that are available to me? Is my autonomy being undermined? And these individual level concerns also, again, translate into societal level concerns and disturbances. And these sort of curated digital worlds, and sometimes not even just digital worlds that we all have come to live in, can promote misinformation. They can sow sort of discord and hate, and they can undermine trust in institutions and others. And as we've all seen, this can have really disturbing consequences. So this is what I'm attaching here to the incoming vector. As I said, it's a caricature. It's not a clean division, but these are concerns that I tend to associate with this provision of content and recommendations and curation of our sort of worldview back to people. Okay, so now I want to convince you that even though we've been doing a lot of cool stuff on the outgoing vector, it doesn't solve these incoming vector problems. And a lot of my sort of reasoning for claiming this is that even if you could sort of restrict and reduce this flow of information into platforms, they still have a lot of information. Even if I manage to put some controls in place, they've already got a lot of data and they have a lot of sources of data, including my neighbor who did not put controls in place. And so because of this collective nature of data, and because of the fact that what we're really concerned about here is a lot of things that are more like inferences rather than needing to know perfectly well everything about me, we see that actually, even if you can put a lot of controls in place on the outgoing vector, there's still the ability to replicate a lot of the same incoming vector harms. So one way to illustrate this is to sort of think about all those technical tools and to realize that even if you could deploy a secure multi-party computed differentially private blah 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 recommendation algorithm, it could still be biased against women. Okay, so we still have a problem on our hands. And it's really, really related to the sort of interconnectedness of all of our data. So now what I'd like to do is, drawing from this paper with Ayelet and Alex, try to give you a little bit of a tour through the existing toolkit to address incoming vector concerns. Yeah.
I was just gonna ask, isn't this by design? I mean, all these privacy tools that we have are designed to keep the functionality. I mean, at the end of every paper, you see that, oh, we still have the same accuracy. We just, by design, that you keep the ingoing vector, basically.
I think that's a great observation. Yeah, at a certain level, yes. It's a different problem. And there's a lot of intentionality in sort of separating those problems. And it's sometimes a really good thing that those things are separated. It's great that you can do machine learning with differential privacy guarantees, but then we now have to worry about what are the consequences of that thing we've learned. And you're right, that's a great observation. It's a different problem space. And that's basically what I'm saying here.
Do you want to take more questions at the end, or what would you prefer?
Let's do another one now, but then I'll stop you when I need to so that I can.
No, I just build on that.
Yeah.
Because in your title you said privacy is important but not enough. But the question then comes from the previous slide where you had those such things as shaping our preferences. What do you mean with enough? What would a sufficient criteria be? When does it stop being a shaping of who I want to marry, what I want to buy? So it was just the question whether it's a universal good or if it's really a satisfying and sufficient criteria.
This is a great question and not one that I'm qualified to answer as a computer scientist. I think that's a question in some sense for a different discipline. But what I can say is that other folks from other disciplines have identified all of these concerns that I raised on the previous slide. And I can tell you that my technology can't solve.
Okay.
That's not to say that was all the concerns. And it's not to say that these are the right concerns that I can't do. But it's a great and important question. Okay, so I want to try to do a little bit of a tour through the existing toolkit to address the incoming vector, so we can start to see some themes and patterns in what it doesn't accomplish. Because there's a lot here, at some point I'm going to have to start going fast. If you're interested in more detail, send me an email and you will get a 60-page paper in response. Okay, so the first category that I'm going to pull out is actually we have a bunch of laws that are related to the incoming vector. In particular, we have in the US, I'm going to focus on US context for some of this. I'll have some European context in some of it, but that's actually an invitation. If you're aware of other contexts that I seem to be less aware of, please send me references. So in the US in particular, we have rules about discrimination in certain contexts. And discrimination is one of these incoming vector concerns. Sometimes personalization is on the basis of or correlates with protected attributes. And we've decided that that's unacceptable in certain contexts as a society. And so sometimes personalization that's happening in this digital context could be identified as in violation of the Civil Rights Act or other laws against discrimination, because there's the deployment of personalization on the basis of discriminatory targeting criteria. Like, I'm going to show this ad to men and this ad to women, or I'm going to show this employment ad to people in this age bracket, but not that age bracket. So since these are the easy cases, we've got a law, we have the problem of how do we find the violations, but we have a law in place. We also have other types of discrimination that can happen very easily and do happen and are documented to happen in this digital context that are a little harder to attach to the existing law, but it's not impossible. So these are examples like discrimination that happens by targeting criteria that are not protected attributes, but that correlate with protected attributes. So say targeting by zip code, good proxy for race in many places. Also, we have more sophisticated types of targeting tools, for example, lookalike audiences and other things like that. They can have discriminatory impact, even if there's nothing discriminatory sort of written in the targeting. And we also have indirect discriminatory impact on the basis of strategic decisions made by the platform. There's a lot of nice evidence of this from work of Sasha Korlova that I'll mention in a little bit more detail as we go along. But a theme in all of this is who is going to see this? Who is going to be able to bring the case? So there's a tool, but it's a difficult tool to deploy in this context. Continuing on this theme, we've got a bunch of other entities and sort of tools that are maybe relevant here in the incoming vector. But there are a lot of challenges with enforcement and a lot of other potential challenges as we go along here. So the potential for maybe sort of leveraging the FTC Act, the potential for taking a perhaps even kind of extremely broad interpretation of existing privacy regulations, particularly, for example, in Europe, to say, oh, when you said privacy, you also meant, you know, all of these other things that philosophers had said privacy is, and let's sort of shove all the incoming vector stuff under there. Sounds nice in theory, not really going to work for us in practice. You could hope that some of the data protection regulations that limit downstream uses of data are going to put enough of a sort of burden on companies that they would maybe change some of their incoming vector practices. There's some sort of restrictions built into some of the data protection regulations that place more burdens around certain categories of data. And you could take a strong stance on what it means for data to reveal things like national origin, and you could try to push and sort of lean on the existing regulation to make some progress on discrimination in this space. There are proposed relaxations of Section 230 that would provide would remove protections from platforms for responsibility for the sort of problematic content, that that's posted on them in various specific contexts. Going to be challenging for a number of reasons, but there's a theme here, which is that we got a bunch of pieces of tools here, but it's really insufficient. Okay, what else do we have? There's a bunch of tools that look like, at a high level, disclosure and consent. I'm going to start with my rant about disclosure and consent. Basically, in all of this data space, when you hear the word control, disclosure, consent, you should feel a little bit uncomfortable because this is a sign that something is happening. Part of what's happening is usually a focus on the individual rather than on the collective nature of data. And by way of that, a total missing of a lot of what's going on in the sense of the incoming vector and personalization and inference. But simultaneously, there's something maybe even more sinister going on, which is the burdening of individuals with an absurd number of uninterpretable, terrible choices. And simultaneously, a move of responsibility onto the individual and away from the platform. So when you hear disclosure, consent, control, when you get these little pop-up things that you're supposed to do something uninterpretable with and you're never going to do it because there's so many of them and you don't even know what it means and you don't know if it has any effect, that's kind of what I actually have some perverse hope that the complaint that I just lodged may actually make disclosure and consent useful in some way, which is that if you can interpret, existing or future regulation as saying that you need meaningful consent, then maybe somebody can come along and claim meaningful consent is not possible, and therefore you can't do consent. But that's a bit of a backdoor kind of a solution. Similarly, if you have regulation that has sort of detailed notice and sort of consent built in, you could claim that detailed enough notice and meaningful consent is just not possible in a lot of these contexts. And therefore, maybe you could use that as a way of sort of saying, by the way, you just can't do this, but we said that you could do it if you had a, detailed enough consent. I think this is, unlikely to be the prong that works, but, put it out there. And I'd just like to say that a lot of recent proposals in the space have a tendency to fall into these same traps of focusing a lot on disclosure, consent, control as tools, which is not to say they're useless, but I think we ought to be very, very aware of their shortcomings. Okay. There's also a bunch of work that tries to pick out specific incoming vector harms. This is like a big US trend. Like Europe is into big pieces of legislation that try to do everything at once, and the US has this tendency to pull out, like, I'm really worried about this specific issue in this specific context, and let me try to drill down into that. Not to say that one or the other is right, it's just an interesting sort of thing that seems to be going on. There's legislation that has attempted to take on experimentation with the concern that we're all guinea pigs and we didn't agree. Nobody signed off to be a guinea pig in this experiment. I have a couple concerns about this sort of attempt. One is kind of, we are all guinea pigs, and that's just the way it's going to be. Consent is not going to fix this, and it's not clear that it needs to be fixed. We're guinea pigs. Like, life is an experiment here, and the internet and all the stuff running around it, it's kind of an experiment. So either you decide everything is an experiment, in which case it's kind of meaningless, or this ends up being, I think, pretty super narrow, the kinds of things that you call experiments and really require consent for. But then again, we're back to consent and disclosure, which I, as you know, don't love. Another example of this is an attempt to try to address filter bubbles. Specifically, it has, again, this sort of consent disclosure trap, but it also has this common theme of a problem, which is what I call the myth of the neutral alternative. So the idea that you should be able to say, hey, I don't want personalized content. I want neutral content. What on earth does that mean? And what does it mean for me to be able to opt out of personalized content when everybody else is opting in, and I get I get to see what my neighbors liked? There seems to be some sort of disconnect with reality in the space of this kind of stuff. we see a bunch of work around transparency. And I'm going to come back to, in some sense, transparency as being clearly part of what we need. But I want to point to some issues that I see in some of these existing attempts to get to transparency. Some of it is just super, super narrow. So for example, there's a lot of emphasis on ads, and in particular, sub-emphasis on political ads, super important. So far from being all of the problem. And I worry a little bit that if we put all our effort into political advertising, we're gonna miss like the fact that most even political manipulation is not explicitly ads. There's also a running theme that a lot of the transparency mandates provide for transparency around things like the targeting criteria, which is actually not enough to expose a lot of the concerns. So what do I mean by this? If I just say, you know, this ad is targeted according to this criteria, that doesn't tell me if the ad was actually delivered in a discriminatory fashion. It's not possible to infer that. And so unless you have information about how content was delivered, to whom it was delivered, not in the sense of like to John, but in the sense of here is how that breaks down across various divides of potential concern. And in particular, how does the incoming vector correlate with the outgoing vector? How does the content you're receiving correlate in various ways with the information that is observed or inferred about you? Unless we can get those correlations, we're unlikely to dig into a lot of, I think, the interesting incoming vector concerns. And that's a common theme in a lot of this. So yeah, so these themes of lack of correlations between sensitive attributes and actual delivery of content, focus on a narrow band of content, and generally these approaches tend to have a lack of flexibility in terms of what's being audited. And this is a space where new concerns are going to be continuously arising. We do need something that has some adaptivity, and almost all of these attempts are setting themselves up for failure in the sense that they're not thinking deeply enough about the fact that this is incredibly sensitive data. And if you want to get some transparency around it, you're going to need to think deeply about privacy and how to do that with privacy guarantees. And a lot of the transparency attempts, I think, are setting themselves up to be shut down as privacy violations, which is another common theme. Just to do this very quickly, there's discussion of external supervisory mechanisms. Definitely a good idea, not thought through sufficiently. We see lots of attempts at self-regulation. Grain of salt required. And then there's a lot of technical work that attempts in various ways to get at some of these incoming vector concerns. I'd say that there's sort of a class of what I would call control-driven models that attempt to say, lock down your data. And that goes back to, in some sense, my control-driven concerns, both in terms of missing the collective nature and sort of missing the ability to hit these sort of incoming vector concerns, but still could be part of the solution, still could be super, super valuable. I'm not saying that, you know, control is bad. I'm saying it doesn't solve the problem by itself. There's this really interesting middleware proposal, if you haven't seen it, out of Stanford. It doesn't have the collective aspect or the sort of ability or intent to address patterns of personalization, but it moves in a direction that I think is adjacent to and potentially really compatible with things that I think are really interesting. There's a bunch of one-off studies, and when I say one-off, I don't mean that as derogatory. I just mean incredibly, incredibly difficult and expensive and thoughtful pieces of work that give us one snapshot of one problem at one point in time and show us, oh man, there's really, really scary things going on in terms of discrimination in provision of ads. And that's amazing and super important, but it's clearly insufficient to give us a picture of what's going on and to potentially allow us to address what's going on at global scale. And I will point to Mozilla Rally as work that I think really, really does have a lot going for it in the approach. So for those who are not familiar with Rally, the idea here is that individuals can opt into sharing browsing data in a way that is only being shared with trusted researchers doing work that has been pre-approved. You know what your data is being used for, you know what data is being gathered, and then researchers can design experiments that can have some of this, ability to get a more cross-sectional view, get more understanding over time. You get a potential ability to do some of this correlation between incoming and outgoing vector. So it has a lot of the sort of threads that I've been trying to pull here as potentially really valuable and important. Hence, I'm really hoping we're going to have some collaborations around this. Okay, so in summary, we see there's some tools, they're insufficient. There's a lot of control consent stuff going on, a lot of failures to recognize the collective nature of data, and the fact that individual level interventions can't solve the sort of collective level problems. There's a lot of focus on individuals, which sometimes in the framing of the question, this is the societal impacts. And there's a broad lack of ability that we collectively as a society have to gain insight into what's happening at scale, continuously, flexibly, independently, and just very little awareness generally of privacy, the privacy sort of technologies that are available, and the ways that we can reduce the conflict between doing this kind of monitoring and protecting people's privacy. Because in many cases, the inherent conflict is pretty minimal. But if you set things up wrong, it's going to look like you have to pick privacy or sort of awareness of what's going on. So what do we say? We say we're in a terrible situation right now. Some of the problems that you might think are obviously happening, we don't even have the evidence to say that the problem exists. Well, I don't want to think about like how you would address the problem if it does in fact exist. And so what we do in this paper is we argue the need for a collective perspective, which we say is transparency that allows visibility into correlations between the incoming and the outgoing vectors with respect to a large number of people. And some of the work that we do in the paper is to try to sort of sketch out what could this look like, what are sort of some of the challenges in the space, how does this resonate with some of the existing work that's being done. Given the time constraints, I'm going to skip through a bunch of things. I will spend a minute just to say we also try to do a little bit of thinking about how can regulation help, because although the infrastructure for building sort of this collective perspective has a substantial technical challenge aspect to it, there's a really important sort of role policy. In particular, there's a role for regulating whatever body would be gathering and receiving data that would be sort of generated in the sort of course of sort of this gathering of the collective perspective. This is incredibly important. Basically, the more you can tie the hands of an entity that's doing this kind of high risk, sensitive data kind of work, the more likely it is to succeed, because we really need the ability to ensure that we can trust the entity, that they can provide solid technical guarantees, and so on and so forth. Regulation can push for platform cooperation with this type of transparency, can not stand in the way of individuals who wish to share their data in the service of transparency. We see a lot of legislation that is potentially actually sitting in the way in the name of privacy. And again, sort of this is sort of an ongoing theme, is to try to, I think policy can also help us avoid creating false conflicts between privacy, security, and transparency. So I will now say that all of this, while enormous and near and dear to my heart and part of both sort of high level systems level thinking and technical stuff that I'm working on, is only part of the story. So I focused in on problems related to personalized content, and there's a lot to do there. But this is part of a broader agenda of like, okay, what are we supposed to do with this data system, this data ecosystem that we've got for ourselves? And so this is a joint project that's co-led by Kobbi Nissim. The other lead researchers on it are Elizabeth Edinburgh, who's a philosopher, Sasha Korolova, who's joining here soon, Benny Pincus, who's a cryptographer, Mutu Venkatasubrahmanyam, who's a cryptographer, and Alex Wood, who's a law scholar, and more expertise needed here. There are other perspectives that are not sufficiently represented in our team, where we've been doing work on thinking about what can we do more generally in a revision of the data ecosystem. What can that look like technically? What can that look like legally? What are the pros and cons of various interventions? And in particular, one model and sort of form of intervention that we spent a lot of time thinking around is something that we call data co-ops. Data co-ops can and do to us mean a wide range of potential types of intervention. But at a high level, what we mean is a layer that sits between individuals and those who use their data. And that layer can potentially be a barrier in some sense through which data must pass, and that is making decisions on behalf of individuals about what passes and with what technical protections in place. But it can also be serving as an entity that is negotiating on behalf of groups of people, that is advocating for their rights and for their interests. And so it's potentially serving multiple purposes in sort of multiple spaces and can have a number of different interpretations. It's maybe not one, it's maybe many. We are not the first, of course, to think about intermediation as a possible way of addressing the concerns of the data ecosystem. This is a super old idea in some sense. There's this really interesting book that sort of, I think, captures the zeitgeist of like the late 90s in thinking about some of these issues. I'll say like there have been multiple waves of people trying to build and sort of conceive of intermediating entities. They've all failed for a variety of reasons. Talk to me more about why I think there's hope today. But to sum it up, there's a huge and rich agenda of work to be done in this space. It touches on many, many, many different disciplines, and it's really sort of fundamental to my understanding of the space that deep collaboration across disciplines is going to be absolutely essential. Please come and talk with me if you're interested about problems in this space. I hope I convinced you that we have an opportunity here on our hands, that there's a lot going on in the policy space, a lot going on in the tech space. There are things we can do, there are things we can build. We don't have to be sort of satisfied with living with the status quo and seeing where it evolves to. I didn't get to do my slide with, but it could go terribly wrong if we don't think it through properly. But that's a major slide that had big yellow exclamation points and things like that. But I think that's why we have academia, is people who are hopefully a little bit more isolated from some of the pressures of the rest of the world, to be able to bring people together from different disciplines and take on these big questions and start to think about alternative realities. So anyway, thank you.